I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. Had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
Oh my God, there it goes!
You were in Tower 1?
On the trying to get downstairs out of the tower, and then on the plaza level, just, you know, working and trying to get people out of the building. And, you know, people were doing the best they can to get out of there. And, you know, it was you know, the stairwells were smoky, but folks were orderly.
Pictures that are difficult to look at. I don't care who you are or what part of the country you live in, but especially for folks living in New York who may have loved ones that are suffering tonight as the nation is suffering. It's been a tough day for all of us.
It's certainly hard to comprehend, no matter how many angles you see it from, as you see the destruction, the stunned shock of all the people involved in this, and it's going to be a long time before we know exactly what happened today.
We will, of course, have continuing coverage for you, home team news in concert with CBS News and CNN News from all points of the country and the world, for that matter. Barry Nestor, one of our editors, has put together a perspective piece looking back at what happened today on the attack on America, and we will see you later.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
Wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real.
So you have no idea right now?
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right? Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion.
The second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. It would appear that there has been another major explosion, this one in the nation's capital.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
Those pictures provided by Barry Nestor showing the destruction in New York and also in Washington, D.C. today, and again, still reacting in many ways as the world is to what happened today in the United States.
And as we try to come up with the words to express what this is like, I mean, you're watching it for yourself. We can only imagine how small children or youngsters are reacting to this as well. On the telephone, we have Tracy Hanger-Hoffman. She's a psychotherapist joining us now. Tracy, how and in what way should we try to explain this tragedy to our children?
Some of that depends on the age of the children and the maturity level of the children. Preschoolers really don't need to see a lot of the pictures that are on the media tonight. They have a difficulty a lot of times distinguishing between fantasy and reality. And they may find it upsetting, and they will mimic or take their emotional reactions from their parents. So if the parents are panicking or crying or yelling or whatever, that's going to be very upsetting to the preschoolers, as it will be to older children also. They'll need lots of cuddle time, lots of reassurance about the safety that we have right here, that yes, this is happening in our country, but it's far away. We can go outside and look around and see there's nothing bad happening right here, so that they can have some sense of safety and some sense of routine. Grade schoolers, I would say, watch the news with them. They know this is happening. They've heard about it at school, but they've heard mostly rumors. They may have watched some of it on the news. And if you have emotional reactions in front of your children, if you're crying, if you're scared, explain that to them. I'm just crying because I'm frightened, or I'm sad for the people who are hurt, or I'm angry that this has happened. Because if you don't explain it, they'll fill it in with their own imagination, and usually it'll be way worse than what the reality of the situation is.
Tracy, I guess the important thing is to keep the lines of communication open between parents and children, between brothers and sisters, between family units, and make sure that everyone is aware that what happened is terrible, but maybe the world is not as terrible as what we have seen today.
Absolutely, and there'll be lots of opportunities to point out good things, that how people help each other and how people stick together and how we support our leaders. Even if we don't agree with our leaders all the time, in situations like this, we stand behind them and we support them. There'll be lots of good lessons that kids can learn from this. And it may be important to focus on the positive things that come out of this in such a scary time.
Tracy, you touched on a couple of points that I think as parents, I mean, we feel that our sense of security has been threatened. We feel helpless. And we don't want to put that onto our children, but then again, I guess we have to calm ourselves first.
Well, yes, and that feeling of helplessness can be rather disturbing. And there are some things that we can do to work against that. You know, they're calling for blood donations, and junior high and high school students are especially good at helping their friends and family members. They band together and support each other. I know there are high school kids who have brothers and sisters in the military, or aunts and uncles in the military. They need to talk to their family members and to their other friends and share their feelings. That will be very helpful to them.
Okay, Tracy Hanger-Hoffman, thank you very much for joining us tonight, giving us some insight into what maybe how we can share some of the grief that we have seen today. We will, of course, have continuing live home team news coverage throughout the evening. Ed Gallick is in Western Pennsylvania. Denise DeFalla is on her way to New York City as we speak right now. Alicia Booth will be covering many vigils that will be held this evening around the Cleveland area. We have our other reporters all positioned around town, around greater Cleveland and outside of Ohio, to bring you the very latest on what happened today, both in New York and Washington. I guess on a personal note, we feel the way that you feel at home, seeing what we're seeing on TV today and feeling what many millions of Americans are feeling. It's hard to not be angry. It's hard not to be sad for the people who lost their lives today. And it's also not to feel, like Cynthia said, that we've been violated. We see pictures like this in many parts of the country, but we always felt it could never happen here. I always had that comfort feeling.
I think we all did.
And I think we all did, but we don't anymore.
But now, as you can see, America was and may in some ways still be under attack, because we don't know about the casualties and how many people have died in this tragic day. Of course, as Jack just mentioned, we'll keep you updated. So stay tuned to Home Team 19, as well as all the resources we have through CBS and CNN, and we will bring you the very latest as America is under attack.
Escalation, both in terms of capability and in terms of intent.
In the surety of it, but we all know that Osama bin Laden is doing everything he can to antagonize American forces, to try and hit against Americans. He's called for the death of Americans, and we ought to respond forcibly.
General Wesley Clark was a guest earlier today on CNN, and he began to express what most would interpret as a sense of outrage that we didn't know this was about to happen. There is a feeling that perhaps even during the last administration, too much emphasis was put on technical intelligence and not human intelligence.
Well, you got that right.
Do you buy that analysis?
Well, I surely do. As a matter of fact, we haven't been putting enough money in to the intelligence community, and we certainly haven't been putting enough human on the ground. That means human intelligence on the ground. And we've got to start doing that. And we've got to do a lot of other things. I reported last Sunday with Wolf Blitzer here that it's amazing, with all of the economic difficulties that they have, that the Russians have a better tactical fighter than we do, that it's more maneuverable, it is faster, and our pilots can fly it better than our F-15, which is becoming quite old, and we've been allowing our military to deteriorate. But not only that, our intelligence, we haven't been beefing it up like we should, and we know that terrorism is a reality out there, and especially against the United States, and we also know many of the people who are doing it. And the people who are excited about this over in the Middle East, who are dancing in the streets, who are making fun of the United States, we ought to remember who they are, because they're enemies of our country.
All right, Aaron and I would like to come back to you, Senator Hatch and Secretary Cohen. Right now, though, we're going to go back to Kabul, Afghanistan, where Nick Robertson has an update for us. Nick?
Well, I think if we review what we've been watching here in the last half an hour or so, we heard, first of all, aircraft coming in, then detonations around the city, then the fire, and more detonations coming from what was we're told is an ammunition dump. We'll also fold into that the information we've been given here that 300 miles south of here in the spiritual heartland of the Taliban, their city of Kandahar, where their leader Mullah Omar lives, no reports of any detonations there. That city well beyond the range of the Northern Alliance forces. Certainly, the Northern Alliance forces, their commander, their key and pivotal commander, enemy number one of the Taliban, in fact, Ahmed Shah Massoud, attacked in a suicide attack on Sunday. Certainly, the Northern Alliance in a position right now to be feeling very, very aggrieved with the Taliban, and certainly very much in a mood for taking the battle to them on their terms. So looking across the city of Kabul now, it is very quiet. Just dogs barking, the fire from the ammunition dump continuing to burn on the horizon. But evaluating everything we've seen here this evening, what we could have heard was some of Massoud's Northern Alliance jets flying in here. This is something that they do very occasionally. Certainly the Northern Alliance very aggrieved at this stage. And then detonations and anti-aircraft fire coming up at the same time. Again, from our vantage point here over the city, very difficult to tell those details, to tell whose aircraft they were, how many detonations there were, whether they were all missiles from aircraft. Details like that, very difficult to tell at night. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning here. We expect to get a clearer idea, perhaps as daylight.
Shortly ago. And he then stayed on to record this extraordinary, which we've seen from many angles, collapse to first one of the trade towers and then of the other. And the attack brought down these two towers upon themselves ultimately, and has left this extraordinary pile of rubble. Video brought to us from yet another person. Meanwhile, we have this crash at the Pentagon, 200 feet wide. Concern at the White House. Obviously, the president was in Florida early today, but then, particularly when word that a fourth plane had been hijacked, which ultimately crashed in the Pennsylvania countryside outside Johnstown, Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. The President of the United States has spent part of this day in an underground bunker in Nebraska. He's on his way back to Washington now. He's going to speak to the nation tonight. The Navy's Atlantic Fleet was at one point diverted to come and bring aircraft carriers to New York Harbor so that they could assist. There's help and assistance descending on New York.
World, we began here in New York City, ground zero of the attack on America. This day's horrific events began with the familiar turbine whine of jet engines over New York City, but this Boeing 767 was too low and not in the regular flight pattern. It was aimed straight for the massive twin towers of the World Trade Center. CBS's Byron Pitts is on the scene tonight. Byron?
Dan, without exaggeration, this part of Manhattan looks like a battlefield. We have seen blood. We have seen body parts. We have watched people die in front of our eyes. This was terrorism like we in America have never seen before. 8:48 a.m. Mayhem in Manhattan.
We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
Come on, guys, keep moving. I was walking to work, and all of a sudden, I see a jet crash into the first tower.
An American Airlines flight loaded with 92 people crashes head-on into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
And then we heard the crash. We ran to the window.
Into the building. It went into the Trade Center.
We hit the Trade Center. We saw the shrapnel fall, and then we said, get out.
And minutes later.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit.
I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up, and I saw the second plane hit.
A second commercial plane, a United Airlines jet, also hijacked, carrying 65 people, plows into the South Tower.
First one we thought was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism.
On the ground, witnesses could not believe their eyes. 70 stories up with the building burning. Reason gave way to desperation. New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. An explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
Less than an hour later, the South Tower came crumbling down.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
But it was far from over.
Tower 2 collapsed into Tower 1. Within minutes after that, we were ordered out.
When the dust settled, signs of life started to emerge.
Chaos. It's just chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy. I can't believe this shit is happening. I really can't. It's nightmares. Armageddon right here.
This was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, but not the first attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, terrorists set off bombs in the basement in an effort to take down the two towers. They failed. Today, mission accomplished.
I tell you what, it's a sad day for America. It really is.
By 2 o'clock this afternoon, firefighters and police officers and paramedics by the hundreds stood by, many of them feeling helpless. There was nothing they could do at this point because the building was still unsecured.
Our main priority is to get in, do a search and rescue, look for survivors, and then clean up what's left. And we can't do that until the building is deemed safe.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always. A sign on a paramedic's van spoke volumes.
We're going to do the best that we can to get people out of there, get into the hospital, get back in line, go back out there and do it again.
New York Port Authority Police Chief William Hall choked back tears. For him, this was no longer just work. On a personal level, because I know that these are all your men and it's a business, but I'm sure that a lot of these guys are your friends. How you helping
Not
out?
a business now, it's personal now.
Sir?
It's personal now. We have to get them.
Back live, we have had little relief here. Take a look at this. About an hour ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. A 42-story building, beaconed by the devastation that had occurred earlier today. No word of any casualties in the building. It was the one calamity that was not a surprise. Police had evacuated the area hours ago. Fearful building number 7 would indeed fall down. This morning when the first tower collapsed, I was standing about 3 blocks away with CBS News correspondent Mika Brzezinski. As a fireball rolled toward us, Mika grabbed her shoes, I grabbed her hand, and we ran like hell. Thousands did. Dan, except for a few sirens, I have never heard New York City this quiet. Graveyard quiet. Dan?
Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. When the first World Trade Center building was hit, rescue workers rushed to it. We're now told that some of those rescue workers died as the second World Trade Center building was hit and eventually the 2 buildings collapsed. Now about today's other terrorist strike at the seat and symbol of U.S. military power, the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon. There were 64 people aboard American Flight 77, the jetliner hijackers used to ram into the Pentagon. CBS News' David Martin reports the deadly impact there. David?
Dan, as you can see behind me, the Pentagon is still smoldering from that direct hit it suffered this morning, but it's finally cooled down enough so that rescue workers can begin the task of recovering the dead and wounded. One early count put the number of dead at 20, but no one expects it to stop there. The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Clip this ball over here, hit another ball and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, "Oh my God."
A hijacked American Airlines jet, which had just taken off from Dulles Airport, flew right up the main highway leading north into Washington and straight into the citadel of American military power.
There was no doubt about it. It was American Airlines slammed right into the building, and there was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
Fearful that, like the World Trade Center, a second airliner was on its way, most of the building's 23,000 workers fled.
Plane's coming in. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Come on. We're not playing around here. Let's go.
F-16 fighters circled overhead looking for a second attack, but the damage had already been done. The plane had drilled a hole about a third of the way through the world's largest office building. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals as the fire spread and an entire section of the building collapsed, trapping many, many more inside.
Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense.
One ray of hope. The Pentagon is undergoing a major renovation, and some of the offices in the path of the plane were vacant.
We're trying to find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
When the plane hit, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld dashed from his office on the other side of the building.
And proceeded down towards the impact point in the building. It actually went outside the building and was helpful in getting several people that were injured onto stretchers, and then came back into the building and was in the National Military Command Center.
With smoke hanging in the air of the command center, Rumsfeld ordered aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers to New York and Washington, where they can serve as floating hospitals, help with the cleanup, and provide air defense against the possibility of more attacks. Rescue efforts are a long way from over, but the FBI is already combing the debris for clues to who was behind this. The Pentagon has put all its bases on the highest state of alert, and the State Department has done the same thing with American embassies around the world. The early suspicion is that Osama bin Laden was behind this, and U.S. officials say eventually there will be military retaliation. Dan?
David Martin reporting live from the Pentagon. President Bush is just reported to have landed at Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington. He is said to be going to the White House itself. From there, he will address the American people tonight. We will see and hear it, of course, live on CBS News. As regards the explosions in Kabul, Afghanistan, a senior Pentagon official now says, and I quote him, "That is not a U.S. strike." Repeat, not a U.S. strike. This despite reports from the scene by at least one reporter on the scene who said that it was a missile strike. A senior Pentagon official says that it's simply not true. It wasn't a U.S. strike. Now, to punish those behind today's attacks, the United States and its people must first determine who they are. We are a country that believes in facts and the pursuit of facts. The facts are few about who's responsible for this. There has been much speculation, italicize, underscore the word speculation about that today, with Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi millionaire, frequently mentioned. No one knows who did this. CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington is following the investigation, checking his sources, and has this live report. Jim?
Dan, apparently we have a little bit more now than just speculation. U.S. intelligence officials and law enforcement no longer have just a theory about today's unprecedented attack. They now have some evidence, and it all points to Osama bin Laden. Sources tell CBS News that hours after the attack, intelligence agents detected what one official is calling significant indicators that the suicide planes were hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that reports to bin Laden. Sources describe the intelligence as communications intercepts, but would not provide any details. It's not definitive, said one official, but it is persuasive. Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him safe refuge, called a press conference. We do not allow Osama bin Laden to operate from our land, the Taliban said, warning the U.S. not to take any, quote, speedy actions to retaliate. Meanwhile, law enforcement sources said there had been no credible claims for the joint attacks and that intelligence had picked up no specific threats aimed at targets inside the United States before the attacks took place. Within minutes of today's attacks, officials were pointing to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by a group with ties to bin Laden, citing it as proof that bin Laden has never given up on his dream to destroy the symbol of America's economic power. And in recent months, analysts say bin Laden has only become more and more sophisticated in his attempts to strike at the United States. They point specifically to his simultaneous attack on 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa.
They also went directly against a U.S. destroyer, which was heavily guarded, and they did put a hole in that ship, the USS Cole. So they have a track record of conducting attacks that one would think they might not be capable of.
Late today, the U.S. intelligence community was rapidly sorting through a priority list of potential suspects within the U.S. for electronic eavesdropping, with sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds. There is also specific physical evidence that investigators are eager to examine. First are the transcripts of communications between the suicide aircraft and ground controllers, and second are cockpit tape recordings of conversations in the doomed aircraft themselves. The working theory is that the hijackers were pilots themselves and forcefully took over the controls to dive the jets straight into their targets. Dan?
Jim Stewart, good work with getting that new information about increasing evidence, real hard evidence, nothing conclusive yet, that bin Laden is tied to this. But do U.S. intelligence officials know where bin Laden is? Still in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Baluchistan? Do they have any idea?
As recently as the beginning of the week, they had reason to believe that he was hanging out in the 2 locations that he has most frequently been at in Afghanistan, and that's the cities of Jalalabad and Kandahar. Now, he travels frequently, Dan, and he does so by SUV and caravans with sometimes as many as 100 guards. It's a safe bet that he is on the move again tonight.
United States Secretary of Defense, thank you, Jim Stewart. U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has begun a briefing at the Pentagon. We pick it up in progress live.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people. Acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman. Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history, and yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act, a series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions and then we'll adjourn. Charlie.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all in any way that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
A show of bipartisan support and solidarity at the Pentagon with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld orchestrating this bipartisan appearance by members of Congress and General Hugh Shelton, the chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. That'll go on for a bit, but the Secretary of Defense never noted for talking a lot on this crisis circumstances, making it clear he wasn't going to say a lot about what's going on. President Bush condemned the terrorist attacks. He vowed to bring those responsible to justice when it is determined who did it. The president is now back in Washington, headed at last report for the White House itself. He intends to address the nation from Washington this evening. We expect that at 9 o'clock Eastern time. That'd be 8 Central, and of course 6 p.m. On the West Coast. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts has the latest. John?
Dan, even as the president makes his way back to the White House, the administration is still trying to come to grips with the scope of this tragedy. Secret Service sources tell CBS News that this indeed was just like Pearl Harbor. There was nothing on their threat assessment, no warning that this was coming.
The president was in Florida when word of the attacks first broke. Reading with a group of elementary students, Mr. Bush was stopped cold when his chief of staff delivered the news.
Move everybody across the street.
Moments later, in Washington, an urgent call to evacuate the White House.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
It was an extraordinary scene as staff and the press corps were rushed from the grounds. If the Pentagon had been targeted, the Secret Service feared the president's home could be next.
Get everybody back. Everybody back.
Fire trucks took up positions on Pennsylvania Avenue, while SWAT teams stood vigil from the roof. Police sealed off a 2-block area around the White House. The only ones left inside the mansion, the vice president and his national security team, coordinating a response to the crisis from the Situation Room. With a continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service would not allow the president to return and had him fly immediately to the security of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
The full scope of the tragedy now apparent, Mr. Bush addressed the nation and vowed these acts of terrorism will not stand.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
From Barksdale, the president headed for Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the Strategic Air Command, where he conferred with his national security staff about how to proceed. Confident that the White House had been secured, he then headed back for Washington, determined to send a signal to the world that America would stand strong in the face of these horrible acts.
And Dan, some more tough talk tonight from the president ahead of his address to the nation. A report just filed from aboard Air Force One. His spokesman, quoting the president, is saying, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one is going to diminish the spirit of this nation." Dan?
John Roberts in Washington Live. John, what's the security situation at the White House at this moment?
Well, Dan, the White House is still locked down. We are not allowed back in. There is a small crew that's been allowed back in to tape the president live tonight at 9 o'clock. You can see the helicopters are just starting to arrive on the south lawn of the White House. Dan, as a security precaution, Air Force One, which is always shadowed by fighter jets wherever it travels, was more than shadowed today. On its way back from Nebraska, there was an F-15 positioned on each wing. And even now, Dan, every once in a while, we hear a fighter jet flying combat air patrol, if you will, over Washington, D.C., something this nation never thought they would see happen. Again, the president just now arriving back at the White House. We'll hear from him later on tonight.
At 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks, John Roberts. One of the few things that seem certain tonight is that these hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. It also took a lot of money to do it. All of that is strongly supported by hard facts now at hand. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who covers aviation for us, has pieced it together. Bob?
Well, Dan, there's no doubt at all it was a highly coordinated attack, launched with simultaneous breaches of security at 3 of the nation's busiest airports this morning. Under the cover of the hectic morning rush hour, when airports are particularly vulnerable, hijackers boarded 4 large passenger jets, 2 each from American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the strongest symbols of U.S. aviation.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into Northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear the plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
285 people died aboard the airliners today, and tonight the FAA is at a loss to explain how the security failures happened this morning. Now, you should know that numerous investigations have revealed gaping holes in this nation's aviation security system. But an important point to remember, and as I continue here, you see the president arriving in Marine One on the south lawn of the White House. It's important to remember that these were suicide attacks this morning, long acknowledged worldwide as the very hardest to stop. There is no piece of equipment, no scanner, no screener that absolutely can stop a terrorist who is willing to die. Dan?
Bob Orr live in Washington, just as you see a live photograph of President Bush stepping off Marine One, the helicopter that brought him from Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One took him a few moments ago. A salute to the Marine Guard and a naturally somber-faced President strides in past the beautiful Rose Garden into the White House and into the Oval Office. The President will be addressing the nation tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That'll be 8 Central, 6 on the far West Coast. President Bush has spoken twice today. On both occasions, among other things, he asked for prayers for the families of victims of today's terrorist attacks. Now, Bob Orr, as we have only a few, well, actually about a minute left in this particular section, but our CBS News coverage will continue, of course. There was this report from Barbara Olson, the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General, who by telephone from the hijacked plane that eventually hit the Pentagon described some of the hijackers as having knife-like equipment. What's that all about?
Well, Dan, I think it could be critical in understanding how the security was breached. Remember, at airport checkpoints, there are 2 main pieces of equipment. There are X-ray machines. They are designed exclusively to look for the shape of a gun. That's the weapon that aviation experts fear. Also, there are magnetometers, metal detectors, and they are designed to pick up any metal, also a gun. But imagine for a moment, we heard apparently that Barbara Olson radioed they were using knife-like devices. What if these were made of some other hard material, some kind of plastic? What if they were disguised as fountain pens or secured somewhere on the body of the person or within a briefcase? They would not automatically set off the kind of alarm bells that a gun would set off. And in order for these attacks to have been promulgated simultaneously, it might go a long way to explain how they were able to breach the system 3 different places at once. Dan?
Bob Orr in Washington. Now you're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now with our special CBS Evening News live coverage of the attack on America from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. It began just before 9 a.m. in New York City rush hour. First, one of the twin towers of the 110-story World Trade Center was hit by a hijacked jetliner. Then the other suffered the same fate. A huge fireball blew all the way through the South Tower. You may want to watch here as the second plane hits. Minutes later, near Washington, a similar attack, a hijacked airliner attack on the Pentagon. A third jetliner crashed near the U.S. military headquarters, setting it aflame. And then in western Pennsylvania, not far from the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, but in southwestern Pennsylvania, a 4th hijacked jet went down. Back in New York City, the unimaginable. After burning for more than an hour, the Trade Center towers collapsed. First one, and then the other. Thousands of concrete and steel thundered down in an avalanche on other buildings and into the streets where firefighters and police were working frantically to help the countless victims. Some of the early victims of this were rescue workers. And then, after fire had raged inside for hours and smoke bellowed through side streets and along the great avenues, yet another major building in the trade complex fell. And tonight, Lower Manhattan, the financial center of the world, lies in ruins. In the nation's capital, a state of emergency and an emergency plan now in effect to keep the federal government running in an orderly way. Congressional leaders were taken to secure locations. The U.S. Capitol complex was evacuated and closed. CBS's Bob Schieffer was among the evacuees. Bob?
Well, Dan, this is something that Washington took very hard, maybe as hard as anything that's ever hit it. First, there was just the shock of seeing those pictures that were coming down from New York, the pictures you've been describing. But second, there was the realization that terrorism for real is for real, and that it could and was happening here. Near panic broke out at the Capitol when rumors spread another airliner was headed there. Pages ran. Senators were understandably perplexed. Let's get away from the building, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing like this had ever happened. As police blocked off the area, smoke from the Pentagon miles away could already be seen. Stunned members and aides made their way to the lawn. The Senate chaplain paused to pray.
Gracious Lord, spread a spirit of calm among us.
In a security procedure never before used, the congressional leaders were helicoptered to a secret location. Those who stayed behind could look to the skies and see U.S. fighter planes as they roared past the Capitol.
They had scrambled F-16 fighter aircraft to cope with any potential threat.
Workers were sent home, heavy security went into effect, and police closed off the city of Washington to outsiders.
Okay, you must be a resident of D.C., emergency personnel or medical to get into the city today.
Parts of the city took on the look of a ghost town. National monuments were blocked off and closed to the public. Information was scarce, but as congressmen emerged from briefings, it was clear a sense of quiet outrage had settled over the national capital.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country.
We're very vulnerable. I think this is a wake-up call for America, a sobering call.
We send the word out particularly to those who have planned and committed these horrific acts that America is strong, America is principled, America is united.
And Dan, that Washington of yesterday, which was the scene of all that partisan fighting, all that was long ago and far away. This is a different city tonight, a city that is slowly realizing this nation is at war.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. This nation at war, a war of terrorism, a war fought in the shadows and then with bursts into the open, as was the case today. Joining us now from our CBS News Washington Bureau is the former Secretary of State for the United States of America, Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, thanks for being with us. How surprised are you about this attack today?
Well, we're all appalled, and as I watch all these pictures, Dan, we've all seen them all day long, and they are surreal. And watching the buildings come down and the attacks on Washington has been the nightmare scenario that people have feared for so long. I have to say, Dan, I ache for America tonight. We are a strong country, and I have faith that we will overcome this, but this is a huge challenge, and America must rise to the challenge.
Did you ever anticipate an attack of this scope?
We always, you know, people talk about horrendous scenarios, but I don't think anybody has ever contemplated all the various pieces of this. As you have said, it is a highly sophisticated operation.
Who do you think was behind it?
I'm not going to speculate on that. You've been very careful in the coverage that I've seen, and I know that there are some reports that you are presenting, or your people, that it's Osama bin Laden. I think it's very important for us to get all the facts straight and investigate it and be sure. And I think calmness has to prevail, despite the fact that this is a highly emotional time for all of us, especially for the families of the victims.
And when it comes time to retaliate, when we have the facts, how will the United States retaliate?
Well, I think, again, we have the strongest military in the world with the finest servicemen and women. We have said in the past that we would retaliate at a time and place of our own choosing. I have complete faith in the military of the United States and in the leadership of America, and we all stand united. This is the ultimate evil, and I think that what is so essential is that the world leaders have already made their statements very clear in support of the United States. This is one of those horrendous events that actually may become a truly unifying factor in trying to deal with this ultimate evil.
Madam Secretary, to those who say, look, this is a direct result, perhaps unavoidable, but a direct result of the United States being so involved in the Middle East, you say what?
I say for only those who do not believe in democracy and human rights can a statement like that be made. Because the United States has stood tall, has tried to deal with the horrendous problems, has done it in an honest way, and I am proud of American policies.
Madam Secretary, ride with me here for just a moment, because word from the White House is that President Bush is going to speak to the American people tonight before what has already been announced. It was previously announced he'd be speaking at 9 o'clock tonight, Eastern Time, 8 Central, 6 on the far Pacific coast. President Bush, now inside the White House, is moving up that time schedule. We don't know exactly when he's going to speak, but we are told that he will be speaking before 9 o'clock Eastern Time. So you may want to stay here with us to hear what the President says to the nation in his first major address. He's spoken to the country twice today, but both times shortly, brief remarks in Florida, then somewhat expanded remarks on videotape in Shreveport, Louisiana. But very soon, we're told, possibly soon, I should rephrase that, certainly before 9 o'clock, we're now advised the President is going to be talking. Now back to our conversation with the former Secretary of State for the United States, Madeleine Albright, and thank you for understanding about that, Madam Secretary. Madam Secretary, when you were in the inner councils of the Clinton administration, and it was decided to strike back at Osama bin Laden after the bombings of our embassies in East Africa, any second thoughts about the sending of those cruise missiles?
No second thoughts. We based our decision on facts that we had. For me, my worst moment as Secretary of State was the bombings of our embassies, and then going to pick up the bodies of those that had died, and also talking to the victims, the Kenyans and the Tanzanians. We had a responsibility to respond. We did it on the basis of facts, and we were at the beginning, I think, of what is this truly horrendous event when events abroad come home to America. And we have to stand tall. America cannot be shut down.
Former Secretary of State for the United States of America, Madeleine Albright, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Now, there's going to be another briefing in Washington coming up soon. We'll carry that for you live, of course. But in the time we have remaining before that briefing starts, let's talk about the casualties from today's attacks. So much is still unknown. The 4 hijacked jetliners carried more than 250 people. We believe that figure to be 261. It could be a little more, a little less. And it must be assumed that all aboard those 4 hijacked planes are dead. So you start with at least 250, probably slightly more dead aboard the hijacked airliners. The Defense Department says, quote, about 100 were killed or injured at the Pentagon. David Martin says that it's widely believed at the Pentagon that that figure will increase, and perhaps significantly. It is far more difficult to account for the thousands who were in the target zone in Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center area, and the emergency workers who rushed to aid them. Keep in mind, 50,000 people work in the World Trade Center tower in that area. Thousands more visited every day, and then today they flooded in police, fire, and other rescue workers fairly quickly. CBS News medical correspondent Elizabeth Caledon is at New York University Hospital tonight. Elizabeth.
Dan, within moments of hearing the news, New York City area hospitals and indeed hospitals throughout the region shut down all normal operations, canceled all elective surgeries, and basically transformed themselves into high-voltage trauma centers for a city under siege.
Once the severity of injuries was assessed at emergency command posts at the site, dust-covered ambulances ferried those in the worst shape to whatever hospitals could take them.
No idea how many people, cops are dead. We have many people hurt. What about the casualties? What have you seen? Uncountable.
Bellevue, one of the city's biggest trauma centers, treated injured when the World Trade Towers were bombed back in 1993. Today, it was deja vu. And despite the enormity of this disaster, the hospital says it was ready.
We've set up intensive care units. We're utilizing that area as sort of an offshoot of the emergency department. Just looking at every place in this hospital where patients could be taken care of, and we assign doctors and nurses to those areas to be ready for the patients as they come in.
Early in the day, the numbers started low, but by afternoon, it was clear the scope of devastation would be unfathomable.
As excavating goes on at the sites, we're going to probably, as we've been told, we're going to see a lot more.
Doctors anticipated every type of injury, everything from burns and smoke inhalation to head trauma, and a tremendous need for blood. In a situation where many felt utterly helpless, that was one way to contribute. An early call for blood led to lines of donors.
We anticipate a tremendous need for blood, so we actually set up several blood donor areas within the hospital for staff to donate. We've now run out of the donor bags for people to donate blood.
Again, Dan, and as you mentioned, the sense is here we are only just beginning to tally the number of injured. In fact, several of the doctors here told me that the injured they're seeing are, in fact, the emergency workers, the firemen and police who were called to the initial plane crash and then were injured when the buildings collapsed. Another major concern, of course, is not just handling the physical wounds, but the psychological trauma of witnessing and surviving such a catastrophe, and that is likely to yield thousands more victims in need of medical assistance, perhaps for years and years to come. Dan?
Elizabeth Callan reporting live from New York University Hospital. The shock waves from the attack on America are being felt far beyond the immediate targets in New York and in our nation's capital, Washington. CBS News correspondents are standing by with that part of the story, beginning with Cynthia Bowers in Chicago. Cynthia, good evening.
Dan, as news of this catastrophic attack spread here in the Chicago area, so did the sense no place is secure.
I was scared. I was very scared.
Within minutes of the first reports, nearly 20,000 people poured out of the Sears Tower, the nation's tallest building, afraid it too was a target.
I would say a sense of anxiety, of nervousness, and people were anxious to leave the building.
Evacuations were ordered in the famed Chicago Loop, including the Board of Trade.
Everyone's concerned. You could see the look on their face.
One by one, federal buildings, museums, and colleges closed down. Extra trains were put on the tracks to get hundreds of thousands of people out of the downtown center, under the watchful eyes of military jets, with hundreds of police on the streets below.
Every sworn personnel in the Chicago Police Department, from the superintendent on down, will remain in uniform until further notice.
Security is so tight across the Midwest, passengers on this Delta jet in Cleveland were evacuated, while authorities made sure a threatened bomb was not on board. As business ground to a halt in Cleveland, workers heading home clogged roadways. Landmarks like the Arch in St. Louis were emptied.
I just felt like better than sitting home watching that, and this helped me feel like I'm doing something.
And blood banks began to fill as the enormity of this catastrophe started to hit home.
I think we need to pray for our country and pray for our president, because, you know, this is the national crisis that people have been talking about for years.
With Americans feeling so vulnerable, officials here in Chicago and everywhere tonight are walking a fine line between taking the necessary precautions without creating additional panic. Dan?
Cynthia Bowers in Chicago, and of course, buildings, some monument-type buildings were closed in Philadelphia. Los Angeles on high alert around Los Angeles International Airport, and so it went today. Now, a briefing is scheduled inside the White House. This is the first actual briefing inside the White House we've had today. This will be Tommy Thompson, former governor of Wisconsin, who's now the Director of Health and Human Services in the Bush administration, John Ashcroft, the one-time senator from Missouri, who is now Attorney General, and FEMA Director Joe Albaugh. We take you live to the White House briefing room.
Mineta and Director Albaugh will each be providing you with updates on how their agencies are responding to today's events, as we'll be giving you as frequent as updates as possible. They will not be taking questions at this time. And with that, I will turn it over to General Ashcroft.
Thank you. Today, America has experienced one of the greatest tragedies ever witnessed on our soil. These heinous acts of violence are an assault on the security of our nation. They are an assault on the security and the freedom of every American citizen. We will not tolerate such acts. We will expend every effort and devote all the necessary resources to bring the people responsible for these acts, these crimes, to justice. Now is the time for us to come together as a nation to offer our support, our prayers for victims and for their families, for the rescue workers, for law enforcement officials, for every one of us that has been changed forever by this horrible tragedy. The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international LEGAT offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy.
Every single American lost something today. And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City, and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, we're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort for the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. It is our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that it's been caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
One of the most cherished freedoms is the freedom of movement, the ability to move freely and safely. But today that freedom was attacked. But we will restore that freedom throughout the national transportation system as soon as possible, and we will restore the highest possible degree of service. These terrorist acts are designed to steal the confidence of Americans. We will restore that confidence. We have already taken some first steps as a precaution.
And so while this is going on at the White House, this is what's happening at the Capitol of the United States. Dennis Hassert, the Speaker of the House, has begun talking as congressmen and senators gather.
One thing that happens here in this place is when American suffers and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together. Senators and House members, Democrats and Republicans will stand shoulder to shoulder. Perpetrated on this nation. We will stand together to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price. We're not sure who this is yet. But we have our suspicions. And when that is justified and when those suspicions are justified, we will act. We will stand with the President, we will stand with this government, and we will stand as Americans together through this time. Thank you.
Now on the steps of the Capitol, Tom Dasher, the Senate Majority Leader.
Today's despicable acts were an assault on our people and on our freedom. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts. Congress will convene tomorrow. And we will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice. We, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, stand strongly united behind the President and will work together to ensure that the full resources of the government are brought to bear in these efforts. Our heartfelt thoughts and our fervent prayers are with the injured and the families of those who have been lost.
We know, as a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We'd ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
Live from Washington on the steps of the Capitol of the United States, literally hundreds of members of Congress. We can't say that every member of Congress in the House and Senate was there, but hundreds were there in a show of solidarity and support, a show of unity in the face of a sneak attack, the second in the lifetime of many of us, a sneak attack on the United States, this time by the shadowy personages who are part of the terrorism operation. There are a number of terrorism operations in the world. Osama bin Laden has been the focal point since 1998 of U.S. intelligence suspicions, but we've said it before, we repeat it without apology. No one knows who is responsible for these dastardly acts today. 3 of the World Trade Center buildings, the 2 Twin Towers and Building 7, destroyed at the World Trade Center. The Pentagon, dead, wounded, and destruction there. Now, coverage of the attack on America continues, including President Bush's address shortly, so stay right here with us. Continuing now our live CBS Evening News coverage of the attack on America from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. 4 commercial jets hijacked and deliberately crashed today. 3 of them hit buildings, 2 the World Trade Center Twin Towers, a 3rd hit the Pentagon. The 4th hijacked airliner went down in southwestern Pennsylvania. New York's towering World Trade Center reduced to rubble. The Pentagon smashed and smoking. Uncounted thousands of people apparently dead or injured. In New York, it's described as a catastrophe in terms of dead and wounded. The figures are unknown. Here's what's happening right now. Rescue workers are scrambling through the war zone remains of Lower Manhattan as well as the Pentagon itself. On a normal day, up to 50,000 people worked in the Twin Towers alone, and many thousands of visitors went through each day. Casualty figures elsewhere include the more than 250 passengers and crew on the 4 hijacked jets, and perhaps 100 dead and injured at least at the Pentagon. But there are few places in the air tonight anywhere in the United States. There are few planes in the air anywhere because the FAA has grounded all civilian aircraft until at least noon tomorrow. Nothing is supposed to fly until at least noon tomorrow when the FAA will have some further information. By the way, the stock exchanges will also be closed tomorrow. President Bush will address the nation from Washington tonight. It originally was scheduled for 9 o'clock Eastern Time. We're told that that will be moved up some. Exactly when the president has now decided to speak, we do not know. We expect it at any time, and we will, of course, carry it live here. President Bush has already promised to, quote, find and punish whoever carried out these cowardly attacks. And federal officials say, not all of the intelligence agencies, but some federal officials say they, quote, strongly suspect that renegade Saudi millionaire Osama bin Laden may have been involved, but there's no confirmation of that whatsoever. And if you're concerned about hearing some reports of U.S. missile strikes in Kabul, Afghanistan, didn't happen. According to senior U.S. officials, what happened in Kabul, Afghanistan, the pictures of explosion and fire there, had nothing to do with any U.S. missile attacks. There haven't been any U.S. missile attacks. While at least one news organization reported that missiles had hit Kabul, Afghanistan, it turns out to be not true. CBS News correspondent Scott Pelley is at the site of today's attacks in Lower Manhattan tonight. And as night falls, Scott, what's the situation there?
Dan, as you can see, the smoke is still rising on Lower Manhattan Island as night falls here. We have spent most of the day with firemen, paramedics, and police officers near the World Trade Center towers. One of the firefighters told us that he didn't see any bodies in the area. He just saw pieces of bodies. Pieces of bodies, he told us, in the street, on the sidewalks. I asked him if he could give us some idea of how many bodies, and he just shook his head sadly and said, far too numerous to have any idea. We have spent a great deal of time with the firefighters. They all describe a scene of overwhelming devastation near Ground Zero at the base of the World Trade Center towers. Firefighters describe bodies in the streets, bodies on the sidewalks, pieces of bodies everywhere. One New York City police chief said, "No one has ever seen anything like this unless they were at Dresden in World War II."
It's a terrible thing. It's like the world is evil, definitely.
1 block from the base of the World Trade Center tower, the inferno burned 4 hours after the attack. Police cars, the first to respond, were incinerated by the collapse of the second tower. Many firefighters and officers were wounded in the collapse, perhaps killed. No one can say how many.
No idea how many people, cops are dead. We have many people hurt.
What about the casualties? What have you seen?
Uncountable. Let's go, let's go.
Courageous firefighters responded from all over New York City, called from off-duty, called from vacation. Renee Davila was the first EMS supervisor at the scene.
I was there, and I saw the building collapse. We all started running. And I ended up inside the Hilton somewhere. I was like trapped. I don't know where I was. I couldn't find my way out with all the smoke and the debris in there. I finally just closed the door behind me and covered it so no more smoke and debris would come in. And what I did was I called my wife. I told her I love her.
Anybody want to volunteer?
Many New Yorkers rushed downtown to volunteer. These construction workers were from Iron Workers Local 40.
What's the job in there?
Whatever it is, to save somebody, one person saved is a life saved.
Through the day, an inferno raged in World Trade Center Building Number 7, another massive office tower. Firefighters feared that it would collapse. And a little more than 8 hours after the attack, the abandoned building fell. 47 stories in the street. This is what's left of the carefully organized files and lives that were the World Trade Center. Bits of paper blasted into the street, construction dust 1 inch or 2 inches deep everywhere you look. What's eerie about this place now, several hours after the initial disaster, is just how quiet it is. You don't hear any ambulances racing away from the World Trade Center anymore.
I saw many injuries.
Hundreds, thousands.
My eyesight did not see hundreds and thousands. I know that my heart and my brain tells me they were hundreds.
One of the sites that we noticed near Ground Zero tonight, it is election day in New York City, a primary election. And near a community center, someone had handwritten a sign that said, "Vote here." Right below that sign, someone had scrawled another that said, "Emergency shelter." Dan?
Scott Pelley in Lower Manhattan. The primary mayoral election in New York was canceled today. The White House has now informed us that President Bush, moving up his time to speak, is now scheduled to speak to the American public, and for that matter to the world, at 8:30 Eastern Time. Less than an hour from now. 8:30 Eastern Time, President Bush will be addressing the nation. That, of course, would be 7:30 in the Central Time Zone, and even earlier, of course, out west. 8:30 now, the time for the President's address. One thing that Attorney General Ashcroft mentioned that my colleague Anthony Mason picked up on, one piece of new information out of that briefing. Ashcroft said that the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, that was American Airlines Flight 11, which is taken off from Boston, was supposed to go to Los Angeles. Attorney General Ashcroft said that that plane, they believe, was hijacked through the use of knives or knives kind of equipment. Now, that would correspond to an earlier report when someone said Barbara Olson, not someone in authority said that Barbara Olson, the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, who was aboard the plane that hit the Pentagon, that she, on cell phone, had described the skyjackers, the hijackers, these terrorists, as trying to take over the plane with knife-like instruments. So now we have two reports on what the Attorney General based his saying that the first plane was also hijacked by knives. We do not know, but now there are indications that at least two of the planes, at a minimum in the early stages, were hijacked with the use of knives or knives-like equipment of some kind. Now, the World Trade Center is in the heart of Lower Manhattan's financial district. It's one reason it was selected as a symbolic target. The attack not only toppled the once majestic towers, it also staggered the struggling U.S. economy and the stock markets. CBS News business correspondent Anthony Mason is here with that part of the story. Anthony, put this in perspective for us.
Dan, to begin with, all U.S. markets were closed today and will remain closed tomorrow. Make no mistake, among the primary targets of this attack were both the financial community and our economy. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange, which has been closed at least through tomorrow, is just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. The major investment firm, Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, was the Trade Center's primary tenant, leasing 50 floors. The financial services firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, had 1,000 employees headquartered near the top of the first tower to be hit. Many Wall Street firms are still trying to account for their employees tonight, and economists are trying to assess the damage to our economy.
This is a very serious event. It's economic shocks that come out of the blue that ultimately send us into economic recessions, and this certainly qualifies as a shock of immense proportion. It's a nationwide disaster, and it could have very serious economic ramifications for a long time to come.
A shock to an economy already in trouble, to an economy kept afloat by consumers whose confidence has become increasingly fragile. The last comparable shock came a decade ago when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the economy was badly wounded.
The Gulf War hit. It made us all very nervous. We lost confidence. We stopped spending. We stopped investing, and a recession did occur. So the similarities are there, and it's very, very possible that today's events could be the proximate cause for the next economic recession.
Some economists are convinced a global recession is now a fait accompli. Overseas markets, which remained open today, all plummeted. London was off 5%. Frankfurt was down 9%. When the U.S. markets finally reopen, many expect they will be hit hard too. This economy has been walking a tightrope for months, and as Wells Fargo's chief economist said today, the terrorist just cut the wire. Dan?
Anthony Mason, of course, our main concern is not money, not financial markets. It's those people who are dead and wounded. But holding to the moment, to this, the financial aspects of this, you've said that markets we know that we close tomorrow. Beyond that, we don't know, but you would not be surprised to see them close beyond that. What is the effect of these markets being closed?
Well, economists say just like it's important for the president to be back in the White House symbolically, it's important for the markets to reopen, to show that America is back to business as usual. That's very difficult. There are a lot of stock market employees who are unaccounted for this evening. So it's hard to get back to business as usual, but psychologically, we need to do that to send a message to the world. And that's why they're hoping that as soon as they can, the markets will reopen.
Anthony, you spoke to one of the traders who was in the World Trade Center this morning. What did he tell you?
He was on the 84th floor of the second tower when the first plane hit the first tower. He was ordered to evacuate, and he did. He got down as far as the 50th floor, and in that second tower, they were actually told in the stairwell, they were given an all clear and said, the building is secure. He told me that some employees at that point actually left the stairwell, got on the elevator to go back up to work in the second tower. Within minutes, the second plane hit the second tower. He was down to the 30th floor at that point. He told me, he said, I thought my life was over, and I thought I was never going to see my children again. But he said panic, there was no panic in the stairwell. People kept going down, he made it out. But when I last talked to him, he said the head trader of his floor was still unaccounted for.
Anthony Mason, thanks. Not everybody made it out, we know. It was confirmed by several eyewitness accounts, one man and woman forced to leap from a very high floor who went down hand in hand. This just in, a firefighters union official in New York, unidentified as far as I can determine, says, quote, there may be up to 200 firefighters, New York firefighters, dead. That's a direct quote. Now let me underscore, as we've tried to do throughout this day, this terrible day, that while this is from someone in a position to know, there's no way to confirm this information. And also by the very nature of what he said, and specifically what this firefighters union official said, he said there may be up to 200 firefighters dead. Now, it's not a chaotic situation in all of New York or even all of Manhattan, but it remains a very dangerous situation in Lower Manhattan. A large section of Lower Manhattan has been completely sealed off, and there have been people ordered to evacuate even as night was falling. So it'll be a long time until we know, but here's another indication that we should be prepared for a very high death toll. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani began trying to prepare public opinion for that earlier in the day. We can hope and pray the death toll will not be anywhere near what's expected, but we should be prepared with that sort of steady determination that Americans are famous for mounting in the face of crisis, for a very high death toll when you have a firemen's union official talking about even the possibility of as many as 200 firefighters being dead. I emphasize again that that is unconfirmed, that is not an official figure, it is a speculative figure. Now, keeping in mind that all civilian aircraft remain grounded tonight, no airport in America is immune this evening from the fear that the East Coast crashes spawned, and that certainly includes the West Coast field that was the destination of so many of the doomed passengers. Sandra Hughes is at Los Angeles International Airport. Sandra?
Dan, California did not go untouched by these horrendous acts of terrorism. With all 4 flights en route to this state, there will be many, many California victims.
Families of the American Airlines victims, surrounded by tight security, were whisked to a private area to be counseled by grief specialists from the airline and the Salvation Army.
There's very little that one can say at a time like this. We simply want to be with them and to comfort them as best we can.
But some people just needed to hold on. Confused passengers looking for guidance stood stunned. Most turned away as all domestic flights were canceled. International flights were to be diverted to nearby Ontario Airport until it closed too.
And then I got here and I read the board and everything was canceled. So I was like, okay. So yeah, I have no idea what I'm gonna do.
Most had just heard the news of the plane crashes and wondered how many had been killed. The scene was chaotic. Police tape held back anyone who tried to get inside the United Terminal as the LAPD bomb squad suited up outside. At a nearby power plant, a suspicious package brought panic. It was nothing. By mid-morning, the entire airport was evacuated.
The FAA mandated early on that we close down LAX and Ontario airports in California, which we have done.
Now, 2,000 flights per day come through the Los Angeles airport. Officials here had said they hope to reopen the airport sometime tomorrow, but they're waiting for official word from the FAA. Dan?
Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport reporting live. Thank you. Those of you in our television and radio audience may want to recall that at the time of the Millennium celebrations, there was, in effect, a near miss that some terrorists attempted to cross from the Canadian border into the United States, and it turned out that what they had hoped to do is to cause some explosions at Los Angeles International Airport. Thanks to the alertness of some U.S. border officials, they caught one of the members of that terrorist conspiracy and exposed the whole conspiracy. That in the background of what happened today, and one additional reason there's so much nervousness around Los Angeles International Airport this day. Now, Jim Axelrod, CBS News correspondent who's been on this story since the very beginning this morning, has a rooftop view of what's happening tonight and some additional information. Jim?
Dan, less than 4 miles behind me is where the Twin Towers stood this morning, but not tonight. Ground zero, as it's being described in today's terror attacks that have sent aftershocks rippling across the country. The sign is at the Atlanta airport. National emergency. Airport closed. But it could have been anywhere in America today.
I'm scared. I'm scared. I want to go home. My safety is more important than my job.
The direct hits in New York and Washington snarled traffic as far away as Anchorage, Alaska, due to security upgrades at Elmendorf Air Force Base. They caused gas lines in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where prices started at $1.55 and then began climbing. They felt it in Florida. Disney World closed in Orlando, and the Florida Marlins baseball game was canceled. Same thing at Turner Field in Atlanta and every other major league game in the country. First time that's happened since the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. In Los Angeles, the Latin Music Grammy Awards that Carlos Santana was practicing for have been canceled for tonight. Madonna's show has also been called off, and television's glamour event, the Emmy Awards, also canceled for Sunday. In New Mexico, the state fair's been shut down, and in Little Rock...
The pilot says, it's 15 years in flying. I've never seen that, but we're actually going to have to land somewhere else.
Stranded travelers whose planes are grounded scrambled for rooms in an unintended destination. Across America tonight, malls are closed, blood banks are open, and this woman at a gym in Dallas seems to speak for so many.
Your own home is being attacked, basically. I mean, I feel personal. I feel like it's personal. I really do.
For perspective, the Latin Music Grammy Awards we just told you about, one of the many events canceled somewhere in the United States, thousands of miles from here. That event had recently been moved to Los Angeles from Miami due to security concerns. Fair question tonight. How exactly does one now define a safer place in the United States? Dan?
Jim Axelrod from high atop one of the buildings in Midtown, New York, which gives us an opportunity to remind you that television is a bit like a flashlight beam. It can show you what's at the end of that beam, doesn't show you what's at the side of the beam, up or below. And the television cameras have been pointed today at the targets, the World Trade Center here in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., all of those targets on the East Coast. So it's in wide areas of Manhattan, and most of Manhattan, which is only a part of New York City as a whole, while there's a lot of tension today and a lot of concern for what was happening, obviously, to the country and particularly on the lower part of Manhattan, that life did go on in most of the city. But all focal points have been and remain tonight on the dead and wounded out of what happened in lower Manhattan and in Washington in the case of the Pentagon. But officials up and down the West Coast found themselves scrambling all day, as well as officials here on the East Coast. Bill Whitaker has been keeping an eye on the West Coast developments. Bill?
Dan, even here 3,000 miles away, the terror struck deep. Airports, businesses, schools across the West closed down. People's reactions, a mixture of fear and anger. Fearing the nation's second largest city might also be a target, workers fled downtown high-rises, leaving the heart of Los Angeles a ghost town. With the Pentagon in flames, giant West Coast defense contractors, Boeing and Raytheon, sent Los Angeles workers home for safety's sake. FBI agents with fingers at the ready ringed the main federal building. City government, law enforcement, indeed the entire city was on high alert.
We believe that whatever could have happened in New York could very likely happen here.
The busy borders with Mexico and Canada intensified security and remained open, but little else did. Urban icons, the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, even Seattle's Space Needle closed down, leaving tourists stunned.
To Pearl Harbor magnified 10 times.
There's heightened alert on the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges, San Francisco's main links. Even Disneyland, the self-proclaimed happiest place on earth, joined other California amusement parks and closed down in fear.
Obviously, what they want is to shut down the country, and that's exactly what they've done.
I mean, it's scary to think that something like this could happen in the United States. I mean, you feel safe here, and now you don't feel as safe.
The West's water and energy suppliers are taking no chances either. At Hoover Dam, boats and bomb-sniffing dogs are on patrol. Armed guards stand outside the San Onofre nuclear plant near San Diego. Up the road, Marine Camp Pendleton is on threat condition D, the highest level of alert, meaning an attack is expected or imminent.
Right now, they are checking every car that's on base, and we are restricting access if you're not a military affiliated.
This afternoon in Los Angeles, Muslim groups citing death threats said don't blame all for the alleged actions of a few.
The pain of this country is in fact our pain.
Saying there's clearly too much hatred, the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County invited people of all faiths to come together and pray for the victims of today's terror. So here, like the rest of the country, prayers for the victims and concerns for the country's future and safety. Dan?
Bill Whitaker reporting live from Los Angeles. The flow of casualties into New York hospitals has slowed tonight. The flow of casualties from the World Trade Center explosions earlier in the day. But the death toll is mounting at emergency rooms, and hospital officials say that they and we have yet to see a fraction of the dead and wounded. Let me repeat that for emphasis. The hospital officials say that they've up to this moment, they haven't even seen, they've seen only a fraction of the dead and wounded, which gives you some idea of what we need to be prepared to face in the days to come. Dr. James Dillard, a pain specialist who usually works in the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital System but was sent to St. Vincent's Hospital near the World Trade Center to help, said, and I quote him, "I have been in here since this morning. It is like a normal busy day, but it is eerie. We expected to get overwhelmed. It is surreal inside, but there are no sick patients. I think so many people are dead. It's a bad sign that there are no mass casualties, meaning wounded. The doctor saying he sees a lot of dead people, more dead than wounded. Fires continue to rage at the scene of the attacks at the 110-story Twin Towers. The fires have ebbed and flowed during the day, but they're still burning. Much of this prevents police and rescue personnel from getting to the wounded or dead. This is according to witnesses on the scene and our own CBS News correspondents. There are believed people trapped in the rubble, the debris from the collapse of the 3 buildings at the World Trade Center, the 2 Twin Towers, and then World Trade Center building number 7. But police, firemen, and other rescue workers have been unable to get to most of those people who are known to be trapped in the rubble. How many of them, we don't know. Some 50,000 people work in and around the World Trade Center. Many other thousands visit it during the day. All of that contributes to this eerie mood in New York City, and particularly in Lower Manhattan this evening. With us is Wuab Ajami, the distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins University, an expert on the Middle East, and for that matter, an expert on terrorism. Well, as hard as it is to say it, Wuab Ajami, they, whoever these evil people are who perpetrated this cowardly attack, in many ways they got what they wanted.
Well, they've succeeded. I think we are vulnerable to this kind of new form of warfare that we've been talking about this afternoon together, and you've been talking about. And they have dramatized our vulnerability. And I think to the extent that there is a political message, because if the trail takes us in the direction of Osama bin Laden and his group and the recruits that he finds, then the message is to dramatize our similarity with and affinity with Israel. Because we've been seeing, if you will, a trail of terror hit Israel now for a good deal of time, and now we are victims of this of the same phenomenon. The idea is to underline the oneness, the similarity of, and the alliance between these two societies. But unless this trail goes cold, and you've been underlining this to us over and over again, unless this trail goes cold, we are really talking about bin Laden and his people, and that's what the reports from Jim Stewart and others have been coming your way.
Well, 2 points. One, as Anthony Mason reminded us, it isn't just the symbolism of the attack now. It has hit the United States at its economic core.
Absolutely.
And there, what happens when the financial markets reopen? They're not supposed to open tomorrow, maybe not the day after, but it's a hammer lick at so much, but it includes a hammer lick at our economy.
Of course, I mean, the whole idea is our imperium, if you will, is of the NASDAQ variety. We have been happy with our economic performance in the 1990s. We sit astride the world. Our economy is so successful. Our job creation is so successful. There were even arguments that said, now politics is finished in the world. It's now the primacy of geoeconomics. And look at the primacy of geoeconomics. 4 men get on 4 aircrafts and do this to a great, proud, successful nation.
That was in the case of the USS Cole. Today, there's never been a terrorism attack on this scale anywhere in the world.
Absolutely not. But you see, if indeed we go back to this bin Laden base and his group, the so-called Al-Qaeda, which is his followers, these people have grown more brazen and more reckless by the day. The first attacks, to the extent that we can pick up his trail, were the attacks against the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, then the attack on the USS Cole, then this. And we've made threats, and we have targeted bin Laden. But these have been pinpricks. There has really been no big price paid for attacks against Americans. I think President Bush is going to be under huge pressure, in effect, to now make good on these threats. This has to be retribution beyond the old raids of the past, if and when we get the trail down right and we know exactly who did this.
If we get the trail down right, and I am going to underscore again, we don't know who did this.
Yes.
Osama bin Laden, his name has been on everybody's lips.
Yes.
But there's no, so far as I know, empirical evidence
yes.
that he's connected to this. The suspicion runs strong, but we've said before, you know, it said after Pearl Harbor, sort of praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. We're now in a position to praise the Lord and let's get some information.
Right. Well, we'd have to unseat the Taliban regime. I mean, this would be, let's be clear about if the evidence and the trail leads us in the direction of bin Laden. And if bin Laden, as we know he is in Afghanistan, you can make a safe bet that the President and the Secretary of Defense and an administration which came in pledged not to be as soft in the world as Bill Clinton was for the 8 years he was around. There will be enormous pressure to unseat the Taliban regime, to go out and find bin Laden. Because bin Laden, we know, is in Afghanistan. Then the pressure will be on this enormous military machine we have, that we have to be protected. And that there is a regime in the world, in many ways friendless, even in the world of Islam. Even the Iranians have no use for the Taliban. They hate them. They think that the Taliban are a disgrace to the world of Islam. And they've criticized the Taliban. So here is this Taliban regime, a regime of radical seminarians. That's what they are. Caught in a war in their own country, over their own country, and you know the land, you've done journalism in Afghanistan. Here is this land which had become a land of brigandage. And now there will be pressure to go out to the source, and the source is the Taliban and the regime.
Fuad Jami, thanks. The President of the United States will be speaking to the nation and the world in about a half hour. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now with live CBS News continuing coverage of the attack on America. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. A series of coordinated, well-financed terror attacks today at the American people and at freedom-loving people everywhere. That is not an overstatement. Without warning, 4 U.S. commercial jetliners were hijacked. 2 were crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City and sent the giant twin towers filled with workers crumbling to the ground. A 3rd hijacked plane slammed into the Pentagon just outside Washington. The 4th hijacked aircraft went down in southwestern Pennsylvania, not far from Camp David, Maryland, the presidential retreat. Here's what's happening at this hour. As the evening goes on, rescue workers are searching for victims, still searching for victims in the rubble of the World Trade Center towers, but it's dangerous there. No count of the dead yet, no count of the wounded, really. One union official says he believes the dead may include some 200 firefighters. That's a quote from one union official and only one. There's absolutely no confirmation of that. Emergency operations are also continuing at the scene of the crashes at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. There were well over 250 people on the 4 crashed planes, well over 250 people on the crashed planes alone. All civilian aircraft have been grounded until at least noon tomorrow in this country. There is unprecedented security around the leadership of the U.S. government. President Bush, who was in Florida when this started, later went to Louisiana, later went to Nebraska, is now back in Washington, back at the White House. The president will address the nation from Washington at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight, a little less than a half hour from now. CBS News will, of course, bring that to you live. President Bush has put the U.S. military on high alert. He vowed that the United States will find and punish whoever is behind what the president described as, quote, these cowardly acts. Early speculation centers on Osama bin Laden. In the Middle East tonight, sad to say, there are some who view today's murderously successful attacks as victories, and there was some celebrating. But as CBS News' David Hawkins reports, so far there have been no credible claims of responsibility.
There's no shortage of people in the Middle East who, for various reasons, hate the United States. Much of the Arab world condemns the U.S. for its support of Israel, and there were some scattered celebrations when news of the carnage reached this part of the world. But while some Palestinian militants said America had it coming, all denied having anything to do with the attacks. Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat seemed as astonished as anyone else.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Some Israeli terrorism experts say Palestinian groups don't have the ability to carry out attacks of such magnitude and complexity. Then, of course, there's Iraq, which has its own scores to settle with the United States. But for radical Islamic fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden, who's declared a religious war against America and has carried out successful attacks in the past, the hatred of the United States runs deeper than politics.
Most Islamic groups are first and foremost interested in domestic issues. Osama bin Laden's group, on the other hand, is interested in the situation of Islam worldwide. Osama bin Laden views himself as the fighter for Islam against Western ways of life.
While the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis and the unhealed wounds of the Gulf War may fuel Osama bin Laden and his followers, their hatred of America and anything not in line with their extreme religious views is far more fundamental. David Hawkins, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
Beyond the Middle East, the scope and destruction of these terrorist attacks hit home like a dagger. Governments and peoples reacted with shock and sympathy, as we hear from CBS's Richard Roth.
It began first thing this morning when a hijacked passenger jet smashed into one of the twin trade towers in New York.
In an electronic instant, it swept around the world, a shockwave echoing the attack on America, the horror and disbelief.
Nationwide panic as Americans try to understand the scale of today's events.
From Buckingham Palace to Beijing, there was shock and sympathy. From the Vatican to the Kremlin, Russian President Putin called for a coordinated effort against terrorism. So did British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
More than not just resting, in Britain they were rattled. Offices closing early in London's financial centre, commercial air traffic over the capital banned, as airlines here and throughout Europe cancelled transatlantic flights.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious, and much more fearful.
With European TV broadcasting live and non-stop, European governments called emergency meetings. So did NATO. Another echo of the attack in America were the questions asked here. Who was behind it and what happens now? The Taliban regime's ambassador to Pakistan today was part of the chorus calling for justice. He also insisted Osama bin Laden wasn't behind it. Bin Laden's not in contact with anyone, the ambassador insisted, and couldn't carry out such activity. It would be a great risk, he warned, for America to retaliate before completing an investigation.
While Britain's calling mass terrorism a new evil the world needs to fight, some Europeans are more blunt. Germany calls the attack a declaration of war against the civilized world. But what all the allies are saying tonight is that America's not in this fight alone. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
As we await President Bush's address to the nation and the world, which will be coming up in about 23 minutes now on the half-hour mark, joining us here in New York again is Sandy Berger, who served as National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and in our CBS News Washington Bureau, Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Thank you both for being with us. First, Senator Dodd, there's been an awful lot of talk today about the United States. We will find who's responsible for this and we will punish them. Why is anybody who hates the United States, why would they believe this when in the past we have proven time and again we can't find out who does the people who do these things, and we've been unable to punish them, really?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me step back for a second and tell you my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of Sandy. I just left about 500 members of Congress on the east front of the Capitol with the leadership, Republicans and Democrats, joined together an expression of solidarity and sympathy for the literally hundreds of people, and I expect thousands who may have lost their lives today. We don't know the numbers yet, as you've reported accurately here, but it's hard to begin any discussion of this without talking about these families and what our country has gone through. And today, you used the language at the outset of your news tonight, using Franklin Delano Roosevelt's language almost 60 years ago, 12 weeks from now, calling this a day of infamy, and it truly is. So I wanted to begin there, and Tom Daschle and Trent Lott are going to have tomorrow a session on resolutions and an opportunity for us to be heard. Congress will be in session tomorrow. Democracy will always triumph over terrorism. And I hope here that we'll first of all concentrate on the tragedy here at home, do what's been suggested by some of your earlier guests, and find out exactly who is responsible here. And I'm confident we can do that. And go a step further here, and I'll be interested in what Sandy has to say about this, but I think a new chapter's been turned here. Too often we have sort of accepted other nations' notion that they would harbor these people, occasionally provide some financing, even training for them, and that they sort of had to do that for their own domestic security. I think those days are over with. I think any nation that supports, harbors, trains these individuals, whether it's Osama bin Laden or others who are responsible for it, there needs to be a collective response. You heard today President Putin. I think the Chinese made similar statements. This is a chance for the civilized world now, if nothing else comes out of this, to respond in the most aggressive and thorough way we can. This cancer is hitting all of us, and we need to respond to it accordingly.
Now, back to the original question, Senator. Are we capable of determining who did these things? And then are we capable of, in some way, finding them, bringing them to justice, punishing them?
I believe so. I think, first of all, this was a highly coordinated, very sophisticated attack here today. And I'm quite confident that the collective intelligence efforts of our allies, friends who have expressed support for us today, that we'll be able to determine that. We may not do it as quickly as some would like, and my hope would be that we'll do it smartly. It's very important that we know what we're talking about before we respond. But I'm very confident we can do it, and I think we have the means of doing it. It may not be as fast as some would like, but I believe it can be done.
Sandy Berger, where are those voices in the world of Islam? Islam being one of the world's great religions. Where are those voices? Are there any, in any place that counts, who say, listen, we've had enough of this, and we will help the United States find and bring to justice these people?
Well, I think we have to be careful, Dan, that we don't condemn the world of Islam here. Obviously, there are 1 billion people who practice Islam around the world. This is perpetrated by a group, and we need to deal aggressively with the group. But I agree with Chris. We need the cooperation and concerted effort of all of our allies and friends, whether they are in Europe, whether they're in the Arab world or elsewhere, because we are now in a new phase of this war against terrorism. This is a watershed event, and we're not going to deal with this in one fell swoop. This is going to require a sustained, serious operation. And I think it's time for the American people to support the president, buckle our seatbelts, because this is going to be a long, hard ride.
True or untrue that in the past when there have been terrorist acts, nothing on this scale has happened, but when there have been terrorist acts, many of our friends and, yes, allies in the Arab world and elsewhere have been afraid to help us respond beyond a certain point because of fear of instability in their own countries.
Well, I think that's true, but this is so qualitatively different than anything we have seen before that we'll quickly decide, we'll quickly know who stands with the terrorists, who stands with disorder, and who stands with a world in which this kind of act is not tolerated. And I think we're going to have to put some of our friends to the test on this.
Senator Chris Dodd, what are the options for the president in increasing the pressure on, yes, our friends and allies to help more, great deal more and faster to deal with the people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes?
Well, it's hard to find any silver linings in what has occurred in the last 12 hours. But if there is any at all, it may be what we've heard already from leaders from around the globe that we haven't heard from in the past when we faced acts of terrorism not on this scale. And I would hope the president would pick up that phone. I'm confident he will. And by the way, all of us stand with him tonight. Anyone who's questioning whether or not this country is divided at all on this issue ought to put those notions aside. Democrats, Republicans, regardless of people's political feelings, we stand behind this president. He's our leader, and if he asks us to do some things in the coming days, he's going to find a united Congress, in my view. But he should also, I would hope, reach out to the allies who've spoken today, and even some of our major competitors in the globe who face similar challenges. This is a cancer that affects all of us, and I'm very confident if he does. There's been a lot of criticism about the administration in the first 8 months or so on the Kyoto agreements and on various other international efforts that we seem to be backing up. In a sense, I hope the president now realizes how important it is, I'm confident he will, that he reach out to these leaders and form that kind of coalition that, as Sandy has said, and he's absolutely right about this, systematically deals with this in the coming years. It's not a one response to this. It's not one attack. It's not going to be solved by one particular raid. This has got to be a systematic, seamless garment that goes on for a long time.
Sandy Berger, in the past, our history, the history of this country, shows that we're sometimes slow to recognize a danger. The build-up to World War II comes to mind. But when there is a Pearl Harbor, or when we're attacked, almost pushed off the Korean Peninsula, once we mobilize as a people, that we are indeed a determined and effective adversary, but we're dealing with such a shadowy operation as these terrorist organizations. Is it capable to put the nation on a one nation united, let's solve this problem, let's defeat this enemy, or impossible?
I have no question that the president can do that, but I think the American people need to understand that this is not going to be solved with one missile attack. We may have to reach deep into a faraway place in a very robust way to deal with this problem. We may have to do this over a sustained period of time, and those actions themselves will have their own consequences. So there's no silver bullet, literally or figuratively here, that is going to deal with the kind of unspeakable evil that we've seen today, the escalation in a massive way, both in terms of capability and malevolent intent that we've seen today. What we need now is buckle down, serious, concerted effort that's going to have to be long range. We've taken down terrorist organizations like Abu Nidal in the 70s. This is qualitatively different, and we're, I think, capable of doing it. I think the American people will support the president, but it's going to take actions we may not have contemplated in the past.
Sandy Berger, Senator Chris Dodd, thank you very much. We're less than 15 minutes away now from the President of the United States addressing the American people and the world about the events of today. In the meantime, let's remind ourselves there were many scenes of heroism as well as horror in the Twin Towers attack here in New York City. CBS's Lee Cowan reports on the people in the streets amid rubble and chaos. I warn you in advance, caution you in advance of the violence in some of these scenes. With that in mind, Lee?
Well, Dan, I think anyone down here this morning will tell you that there simply wasn't any time to do anything. Wasn't time to think, wasn't time to breathe. Certainly there wasn't time to mourn. The only thing you could do is run, and if you could, help. For those inside the World Trade Center, it wasn't just hell on earth. For Bob Fox, it was hell 39 stories up.
It was unbelievable. I was on the 39th floor about 8:45 when a tremendous explosion hit.
Those lucky enough to get out walked out of one danger right into another. A moonscape of ash and debris, smoke and fire, leaking gas, and already the smell of death.
Debris, smoke, all the dust, everything, just couldn't see nothing. And I was praying to God then that, let me get by this now.
Ironworker Tony Cabrera rushed toward the carnage to try and help.
Then I seen the second plane hit. I went into this lobby. When I went into the lobby, I was there with the fire department and everything, and just, it was starting to give away this and that, pieces of people coming down, parts, and whatever.
Never seen anything like it.
Never.
Rescuers were at a loss. Smoke so thick they couldn't see the damage. The clamor of falling debris so loud they couldn't hear the cries for help. All of it made worse when the first of the Twin Towers came tumbling down upon them. After the first series of explosions, there was hardly time to get in, and those that did were right in line of fire for the next series of explosions. As the second tower collapsed, Val Coleman had a front row seat to disaster, watching it all unfold out of his apartment window just 5 blocks away.
And a great blossom of flame, a huge red fireball, scared the hell out of me.
Val Coleman was inside the World Trade Center just 15 minutes before the initial attack and remembers the last person he talked with.
A very nice young man, answered me very politely. I left, came back here, and boom, he's probably dead.
And as he sat watching the building burn, Coleman could see tiny black specks near the top floors. They were people jumping off instead of being burned alive.
I must have seen 10 or 15 people come down, one after another.
Off the top?
Off what appeared to be the top.
The bombings today brought one horrific scene after another. But rescuers know once they get closer to what's left of the Twin Towers, the images are sure to get worse. But the workers, for many of them, though, they are still waiting. We are told now, Dan, that firefighters are trying to stretch ladders out across some of the debris to begin putting out some of the fires that have been burning all day long. But active search and rescue efforts are still on hold at this hour. There is still hope here tonight. But for the moment, it's being tempered by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Dan.
Lee Cowan, one of our many reporters covering in Lower Manhattan. The terror attacks on the World Trade Center struck deep into the hearts of New Yorkers. Many were witness to or victims of this cowardly act of mass destruction. CBS's Mika Brzezinski has been out among them on the streets of New York.
There was terror in the streets while the Twin Towers burned. With gridlock on the ground, crowds watched from afar and prayed.
You don't see people jumping from the windows.
Police jumped into action, moving the crowds behind police lines, away from danger.
Let's go!
But not far enough. One after another, the towers fell to pieces, debris falling onto hundreds of onlookers. Somewhere behind the billow of smoke, an American icon had disappeared, transforming the New York skyline forever. On the sidelines, people watched and wept. Others, covered in soot and debris,
Come on, can you stop off? Come on.
counted their blessings. Even now, no one can guess the number of dead and wounded. Adding to the confusion, cell service was crippled, cutting the lifeline for families trying to locate loved ones. Only a few could get through.
It's gonna be okay.
Nearby schools evacuated so quickly, parents had no idea where to go to find their children. Everywhere, there was terror and confusion.
Everybody, please start walking towards the east side.
Finally, people simply walked away from Lower Manhattan. An eerie calm prevailed as police evacuated the area. Cell phone service for much of New York City is still somewhat crippled, though the situation is getting better. Several forms of transportation have been affected. Several subway lines are suspended indefinitely, and train service out of the city is limited. It will be no business as usual for school kids in New York City tomorrow. All New York City public schools are closed, at least for tomorrow. And the mayor of New York said earlier today, stay home and stay calm. At least try. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski. The specter is being raised tonight of hundreds and perhaps thousands, that's a quote from one New York City official, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people being, in effect, buried alive by the avalanche of destruction which developed in the wake of the 2 planes hitting the World Trade Centers today. Keep in mind that some rescue workers, firemen,